really a big pleasure to be here, and sort of daunting for a psychologist who has not ever presented to historians before. But I wanted to honor my father and mother's work by doing a piece for this group that was related to their work, that comes out of their work. And before I start, well, I've started. I got an email this morning from Eli Evans, who's a member of the Society, who asked if I would read a short tribute to my father. A few thoughts about Gus by Eli Evans. When I entered the field of Southern Jewish history in the late 1960s, Gus Kaufman was one of a handful of names given to me by Saul Wiener. Is it Wiener or Weiner? Weiner, I'm sorry. The founder of our society, and Rabbi Malcolm Stern, the great American Jewish genealogist of our field. Go and see Gus and Marion, they said. You'll love them. And they were right. Gus was among the handful of amateur historians who labored in the vineyard of small towns and congregational histories and cemetery lore, and kept our field lively and constantly replenished. In fact, he wrote a beautiful and incredibly helpful history of Congregation Sharei Israel, Macon, Georgia, that was one of the best of the genre. He loved the family oral histories, which were the backbone and soul of the field. All this he did with overflowing enthusiasm, endless energy, and abounding love. I'm so grateful to Gus Jr. for reminding us of all that his father accomplished, and what a warm and welcoming couple Gus and Marion were. They were a team, and I look back on his many letters and phone calls, and the hugs with which he and Marion greeted me at every meeting of the society. So this is a personal tribute that I'll be doing. I'll be doing it from my perspective as a psychologist, because that's who I am. My title is Becoming White People, Letters of the Kaufman Family from Georgia to Germany, 1850 to 1863. And 10 years ago, my parents went to New York for a special preview of the musical Titanic. It was a preview for the Strauss family, because Isidor Strauss and Ida Blund Strauss, who was originally from Savannah, who went down with the ship, were major characters in the musical because they're part of the story. And our connection was that my father's grandmother was Matilda Strauss, who had come from Germany. And because my father's grandfather, Julius Kaufman, had essentially, as we understand it, brought Lazarus Strauss over from Germany and went into business in Talbot in Georgia with him, had a store together, and then after a couple of years, Lazarus brought his sons over and his wife, including Isidore, who was quite young. So we were all pretty connected, and my father was an officer of the Strauss Historical Society. So when they went up for this musical, they went over to the Leo Baeck Institute for German Jewish Studies. My father was an inveterate amateur researcher. And he mentioned that he had sent the archive this book that he had written a couple of years before. The Family of Simon Kaufman, 1796 to 1879, of Lichtenau, Germany. And the archivist said she would go get it from their files. So she did, and when she came back, she had 2 folders. And she said, you know, we have 2 things here on Simon Kaufman of Lichtenau, Germany. The other folder contained 4 handwritten letters, briefs they called them in German or Yiddish, and a certificate, a copy of Simon Kaufman's parents' marriage certificate of 1819, marriage contract. So As my father wrote, the contents of those letters and some of what happened to the intertwined Kaufman and Strauss families in those years and to the Kaufman family that remained behind in Germany. They were so unusual, and they led me, and now this is my personal piece, to thoughts about how what Cornel West and Michael Lerner, two of my heroes, put it, that the Jews, who were the despised others of Europe, came to a land where that position was already occupied. And that's what I'll be talking about in these letters. My father, Gus Kaufman, and you can tell we were pretty assimilated Southern Jews by the fact that I'm Gus Jr. For most of his life, he ran his mother's family's business in Macon, Georgia, G. Byrne Company. I'm Gus Byrne Kaufman, Jr. When he retired, he and my mother began to dabble, and then they dove into Southern Jewish history. And in 1992, they went to Europe with me. I had a psychology conference in Amsterdam. They met me, and we drove down to the area of the Rhineland where the Kaufman family and where my mother's family, the Waxelbaums, and some of the Waxelbaum family are here today, came from. The little towns where that they left in the middle of the 19th century. And when we came back, Dad wrote this book about the Kaufman family. He and my mother went on after that to create 3 more books of Southern Jewish history. The Jewish Burials of Macon, Georgia, 1844 to 1997, and then one with the scintillating title of 1,490 Listings of Marriages of Macon and Bibb County, Georgia, with one or more spouses of Jewish birth, 1823 to 1998. What they did is they would go to the courthouse, and they would go to all of the archives and the newspapers at the Washington Memorial Library in Macon, and they would spend day after day after day after day combing the records to find and compile the detailed history of the Jewish population of that area, and really put together resource books. And then the last book my dad put together was called The Great Migration and the Founding of Congregation Shara Israel in Macon, 1881 to 1910. Though we were not members of that congregation, he was just interested, and he put together the history of them coming from the shtetls to Macon and compile 3 histories that men from that congregation had written about their own lives, put it together. My father died on January 4th of this year at the age of 89. And in his eulogy, Rabbi Schlesinger, at my request, quoted what I thought was the Talmud, a saying that when an old man dies, it's like a library burns. That may be an African saying, it turns out, which is not unrelated to my themes. So my father was a storyteller, and I want to tell you a story that was partly one he told, partly one of our family earlier, and partly one I think we're all a part of. I told you about them finding these 4 letters in the Beck archive, Leo Beck archive. I want to read you some key passages from me from those letters, and particularly from the first letter, which is written from Burke County, Georgia, over in eastern Georgia. I don't even know where they were living. The county seat is, I think, Waynesville, maybe Waynesboro. And this is written December 15th, 1850. And it contains passages from three of the 4 brothers who came over from Germany had written in it. We don't know when they left this little town on the Rhine, Lichtenau. We don't know when they arrived in America. We know that by 1851 they had a store that was advertising in, I think, Oglethorpe, Georgia, over near the Alabama border. But this letter, which, as I say, was found 10 years ago, is really the first record we have of them being here, and it's recently discovered. And the first letter is from the oldest brother, Jacob, who was, I think, about 30. And he's writing back because eventually four Kaufman brothers came and left behind their parents and their youngest sister, who was a young teenager when they left, I think. Though again, I don't know exactly when they left. And a later letter she wrote says, well, a later letter Isidore Straus wrote says that she cannot remember what they looked like anymore when Isidore goes to visit the Kaufman parents back in Germany. So, dear parents and brother, because at least one brother was left behind, and sisters, and also my dear grandmother, uncles, and aunts. We received your dear letter with heartfelt joy and see from it that you're all, thank God, healthy and well. The same you can also hear from us. We would have written sooner already, but because we wanted to send you some gold at the same time, which we couldn't do before, we had bought our winter merchandise. They've been peddlers and they're already starting a little store. We have a large stock of goods, all kinds of things on which one can make some money. If we didn't live so far from a city where one could take advantage, when one could take an exchange check for Germany, then we could do much more for you. But if we stay healthy, we can send you something again this winter or next spring. Dear parents, don't be discouraged. Time will make everything good. We have a very good prospect for this year. The cotton is very high. They don't mean that high, they mean the prices. It's the only product here that brings money into the country. And this is Jacob writing, and he says about the youngest brother who's arrived, Marx, or Morris, or Marcus he eventually becomes, but he calls him Marx. Marx couldn't do much until now because he can't tolerate the heat yet. With the language, he comes along fine. By the way, these letters are written in what's called the Suderland script. It's a kind of German script that I cannot read, but my translator, our translator in New York, Ellen Musso, did a good job with it. He understands it very quickly. In other respects, we have to have patience with him, but that'll get better because he doesn't have to go often. I think they went out trading. And then they talk about a friend who might come over. He said it would be great. It would please me to have a relative here. We don't have a single relative in this country. But the people here are very friendly. One is at home wherever one goes. I wish sometime to be with you for just 1 hour. But I hope the time will come we will see ourselves all together again in the enjoyment of our family. In the hope we find you still happily together, which is the wish of your son, Jacob Kaufman. They never did get back together as far as we know. So then there's a very brief note from Dad's grandfather, the next brother, Julius, saying, let's see, heartiest greeting you all and wish them all to live well. Then the letter that made me want to come talk to you, which is from this youngest brother who was there, Marx. My dear parents, brothers, sisters, dear grandmother, uncle, and aunt, today we received your affectionate letter with the greatest and most deeply felt joy, the happiness we felt you can imagine. Let's see, I'll skip a little bit. I want to write you now about our situation. We don't have the same opportunity here as in Germany because the manners and customs here in the area where we are so greatly different from those in North America. I think he means the rest of the country, as they are from Germany. And even greater is the difference in earning money. We have here a large store with goods from all possible continents, especially in durable goods, and in gold merchandise, for which we get very high prices. Our dear Julius is a steward and takes care of the purchases. We have had a lot of merchandise this winter, and dear Jacob and I go peddling, which we do very well. Business is going very well this year because the cotton's high in price. The people are getting so much money they don't know what they should do with the money, except spend it. And for what? Not for theater or concerts or balls, but they buy the finest clothes, gold jewelry, and other fine things, which household things. What they see and want, they buy it when they like it. $20 or $20 is valued as little as this part you can't read. Now here's the key part. The white people don't really work. Each white man is highly respected if he has a good name, good reputation. Poor people don't exist here. I think he means the white people. There's no difference among white people. They don't know about Jews. They have no opinion about Jews. One is at home in every house. If you don't give a bad name, or you're not a false or dissembling person, the law is we are all one and all impartial. I asked Dr. Angelika Balmer, who teaches here at Emory, who's from Germany, and has studied these kinds of things, to look at this letter because it's awkward text. And she said, basically he's saying that they treat everyone impartially who's white. And then he goes on about how they eat. It's nothing similar to the German. For breakfast, they usually have roast chicken and 2 or 3 sorts of meats and biscuits and cornbread and coffee. For lunch, the same or more. In the evening, the same. 3 times coffee all day. And you have to digest this also. There's not much else here except very much meat and money. Yeah. Then he says, next sentence, the Negroes or blacks are living totally separately here from the whites. They're slaves here and must work in the fields. They're beaten so that the skin and the blood flies off their bodies. There are 15 times more blacks than whites. They're living like animals here. Each black has to do what he's ordered. And if he doesn't do it, one can do with him what he wants to. A black man, a good worker, is valued at 12 to 14, I believe it's dollars, it may be thalers, which was the German money. With a wife, a good worker is valued at $8 or $10. There's much trading done with him. They're bought and sold. Then there's a break, a space, and these letters are very tiny because they wanted to squeeze a lot in. He says, my dears, you may think I have become a different person. That's not wrongly thought. For as long as I've been here, this short time, I've already learned to speak English very well because I haven't heard another word. I can speak very well and with anybody. I've been approximately 6 weeks at my dear brother Julius's store, where I've learned the most. And in business, I make every effort because it pays off tenfold. We have many items on which we make more than 100%. I can't write you everything because I have no time. Here, time is money. I have to close. And he asks about our dear brother Carl, who's still, or Charles, who's still back in Germany, and his sister Yetala, that's Yetta, which is Henrietta. And he wants to send her a present because she's getting married. And heartiest greetings to all the rest. And he says when my dear brother Charles is supposed to become a soldier, he shouldn't enlist. He should either stay in France, they're right across the river from Strasbourg, or start a bakery, which I think the family did, or he should come to us. Whatever he likes best he should do, we'll gladly send him money for this. I remain your loyal son, Marx. Well, that really moved me a lot when I read that, how the Kaufmans had come to a place where they were being fed at the table, as you'll see in a later letter if I get to it. I'm wanting to keep up with my time. the 1863 letter with the white people, unlike in Germany where, you know, there was so many restrictions. You couldn't own land, you paid taxes you had to pay a tax to live, a tax to worship. The conditions were pretty bad, and especially after the failed 1848 revolution, there was more anti-Semitism, more crackdown. But then seeing this unfamiliar phenomenon of how the black people were treated. And I think his saying, I've become a different person, is not just about speaking a different language. I think it's about something a little bit more. So, let me go back to my text a moment. When I heard this, when I read this, it evoked two things for me. One is in 1995, Cornel West and Michael Lerner came here to Atlanta to speak at the Temple. Cornel West is a Harvard professor of African American Studies and Religion. Michael Lerner founded Tikkun, the Jewish Renewal Movement, activist. And we had several people, 100 people there at the Temple, about equally black and white. And the idea I heard from them is that when Jews came to America, this notion that the role that they had occupied in Europe of being this despised other, this vilified, oppressed people, was occupied. And that the Jews could be part of the white people. But, they said, to be a Jew means to fundamentally identify with the oppressed. And Lerner, talking about this, he says there's a split in Jewish consciousness here that he grew up with, at least. Was the goal to become Jewish or to hide your Jewishness and pass? And he said that the thrust of our Jewish text is that the world is full of oppression and we're to struggle against it. And Jews, he says, have often been uncomfortable with this revolutionary thrust and have tried to run away from it or soften it or play it down. That resonated with my experience growing up in Macon, Georgia in the 1950s and 60s, and with my father's experience, and with, I think, these brothers' experiences. I also was struck by when I heard Eric Goldstein, our chairperson, talk about his book a few years ago at the Bremen. And I'm going to quote just one thing from him. He's talking about in the 1870s. He said, "From the earliest days of our republic, the notion of an essential divide between whites and blacks has served as a master narrative, offering white Americans a clear means by which they could fortify their own self-image and imagine themselves as racially superior." He, of course, talks about the price of whiteness, the title of this book. Now, I want to look briefly at one of the other letters, the letter from Julius, my dad's grandfather. Let's see if I can put my finger on it quickly. Wait a second. Okay. Julius also writes about, in 1863, he's writing about being in Columbus, Georgia, and he had moved from Talbotton. But in between, he had served in the Civil War, fighting for the South. This man who in the 1840s, 1850 had come from Germany to escape oppression, fights for the Confederacy, is discharged in Virginia with what my family said, used to tell us was a wound. It just says a fractured leg in the discharge papers. Walked back to Talbotton, Georgia from Virginia. When he gets there, in late 1862 or late 1862, he's faced with a grand jury presentment from the Talbot County Grand Jury, and I'm going to read you just a few lines from it. "As jurors, we feel we cannot discharge our duty to the community and ourselves without some remarks concerning the spirit of extortion so prevalent in all parts of our country. And then I'll skip. We think we do no injustice to that class of our population known as Jews when we assert that the responsibility for much of this evil is directly chargeable to them. Then I'll skip again. We cannot refrain in this connection from advising and admonishing our people to have as little as possible to do with this class, of no advantage to us in any respect whatsoever. Let us withhold that encouragement that has been means of fastening these vampires upon every community in the South. So, the Jewish families of Talbotton, the Strausses and the Kaufmans, moved into Columbus, which was 10 hours away in one of the letters, but 40 miles. Talbot County became, my father wrote in a talk he gave to the Talbot County Wild Game Association's, the Historical Society Wild Game Dinner, the annual dinner. The county became Judenfrei, free of Jews, for 40 years. And my father's father was born in 1880 in Columbus. He was named for his grandfather in Germany, who had died in 1879, so we know there was some contact still. My father was born in Columbus in 1918. His parents, times were bad in the 20s already in the South, and his parents moved to Miami and then separated, and my father at 11 came to Macon, where his mother's family was from, and grew up there and in the bosom of his mother's family. His uncle Aaron Byrne was a big influence on him. He died in 1937 of pneumonia, but as a fairly young man, 40s. But Aaron was a brilliant writer, though it took me until about 7 or 8 years ago to find out he was actually a gay man. I'm now a gay man, and I'm interested in that history. But he was a brilliant writer. He was friends with Walter White, who was the secretary of the NAACP for 30 or 40 years. He wrote about the Harlem Renaissance. He would review the books. And the paper wouldn't let him refer to black people as Mr. or Mrs. So after quitting and still not getting his way, he came back to work, but he awarded honorary doctorates to all black people he wrote about. So my father, I think learning from him, although we had a lot of sort of right-wing, or whatever you want to call it, conservative family, our cousin Charlie Block, who was the business lawyer, wrote a book called States' Rights, the Law of the Land, and he argued before the Supreme Court for segregation. So, but we had conservative family, but my father joined the NAACP in the 1940s, and he helped found the Council on Human Relations in Macon, which was a biracial group, which in the 50s was pretty criminal. And one more interesting note, there was a interracial commune in South Georgia, Koinonia, founded by Clarence Jordan from Talbotton. And they were bombed, machine gunned, threatened in every way, and they couldn't buy food, they couldn't buy supplies anywhere south of Atlanta. And my father arranged for them to be able to get supplies in Macon. And he was investigated by the Bibb County grand jury. So back to the story. The brothers, when they moved to Columbus, one of them moved to Fort Gaines, Georgia, and died there, Carl. The brother Marks moved to Texas, married a woman named Mary. We don't know who she was. They stopped being Jewish, although there's still descendants out there. But the German branch, I'll say just a word and I'm almost done. Henrietta, the sister left behind, Getela, married, had 3 children. Her daughter Mathilde survived the camps. Most of the family was killed. She was in Gurs in the south of France. Came to New York in 1946 with her daughter and son-in-law, all of whom survived the camps. Never knew about the Kaufman family of the South, we don't think, but they somehow had kept these letters through the war. How, we don't know. When she died, her husband, Fritz Schlesinger, in 1977, donated these letters to the Leo Deck. And that's how they came to be with us. And, when I put all this together, and I think about what I was raised with by my father, I feel like I can proudly say that in the full sense of the term, I was raised Jewish. So. Yes.
I wanted to ask Gus if, from the letter from your great whatever it was, who talked about what his impression of what was happening to the slaves.
Yeah.
Was there anything else in any correspondence or anything that you know about that showed a difference between the way these recent German immigrants treated the black population, the slaves that they saw, and whether that their Jewishness influenced how they treated the black population in the next generation as they opened their stores, etc. I don't know if you have any evidence of any of that.
Well, in my father's book about the Kaufman family, and in some of his other writing about the intertwined business between the Strausses and the Kaufmans. The Strausses, by the way, the people who founded Macy's after they left Columbus. They went to work for R.H. Macy, and then they bought him out, essentially, in New York. And my father wrote, in reviewing their stuff, that people tended to avoid talking about the situation with the blacks. In one of Isidore's letters back from Germany, he was sent by a bunch of people in Columbus to run the blockade during the Civil War and sell cotton and Confederate bonds in Europe, in England, and in Germany. And that's when he went back and visited the Kaufmans. But he's talking to his family and telling them, based on the situation over here, here's what to buy and sell. And he says, don't buy blacks. Don't buy slaves. So, but generally they avoided talking about that situation in the letters, I think, because of course it was a very prevalent situation. So the answer is essentially no. There's not much comment about that at all.
Yes.
I don't want the reticence to dominate this section. Since somebody else brought up the subject of Charlie Block, I think it would be interesting for you all to know a little bit more. I'd like to know a little bit more about it. There's very interesting correspondence between him and my late husband, Rabbi Rothschild, right here at Emory, where we're going to go after lunch at the library. And I wonder especially with Gus. I have trouble with that because to me his father was Gus. But since you are a psychologist and a historian, this is your field, to do a study of Charlie Block, because to me this man was typical, almost a prototype of the many good Jewish Southerners who were on the other side of civil rights, and there's very interesting correspondence, but maybe you can tell us something that we don't know yet.
He also used to write letters to my husband, Charlie Block, how slavery was in the Bible. And he would think around.
Well, Charlie Block, who I remember pretty well also, he was an old man when I was when I was even a child, but I remember him from synagogue, and when I turned 13, he wrote me and said, now you can join the Children of the Confederacy. An organization, which I declined. Yeah.
I just want to point out that there is actually a published article on Charles Block written by Clyde Webb.
Okay.
And I believe it was also sort of woven into his book. fight against fear. So if you're interested, you can pursue that source.
Okay. Well, we also have a Jewish value, yes, hara, lashon hara, which is to speak no evil. And my father in private would say things about Charlie in that branch, but he was very cordial to him and friendly to him and did business with him. And I think worked, as Vincent Gelfman said, to bring him around some. But, Charlie had grown up in rural Louisiana, and that branch of the family came over when they encountered anti-Semitism in Louisiana. They came to Georgia. So what made him that way, I don't totally know. It's a bygone era, I hope.
Well, thank you all for coming.